talking about the Squad Unreal Engine 5 playtest that occurred this past weekend. Specifically when it comes to how rounds perform, general performance, and some of the things I may have noticed during the playtest. So if you enjoy this sort of update, hit the subscribe button, leave a like, drop a comment down below with your thoughts on the playtest if you participated, and let's get to it. To start out, there are some other new things incorporated in the playtest that I didn't expect. For example, the IMF is now getting a T-72A tank variant, meaning they won't just be stuck with a T-62. It also appears that they added a little bit of extra detail to the gunner sight, but it does look like the T-72 will come with AP, HE, and frag. This newer MBT should provide them with a little bit better armor capability, especially when it comes to those tank fights. It does appear that there's been some adjustments to some of the weaponry within this faction, as I don't see the M16 available, but I do see some of the AKs that we're familiar with from the WPMC faction. Next up is a new weapon introduced for the faction, the VSS Ventores. Similar to the Asval, it is meant to be a suppressed marksman rifle with a magnified optic wooden stock, so there are some slight variations from this to the Asval itself. The IMF Scout Kit is also going to get a recon drone, similar to the Commander drone, but without the role of Commander. This should allow for greater scouting capability at the squad level. Imagine your FTLs being able to quickly mark mortar locations or positions of enemy emplacements to help speed up the sort of intel gathering process. I think this is a huge bonus to the IMF, gives them greater capability, especially with information. The British Armed Forces are receiving an additional scope for their L85A2. They'll be receiving the M150 magnified optic. But what's more noticeable is the British Armed Forces, the Canadian Armed Forces, and the USA are getting a Pathfinder role. I'm not sure if this will be available across all battle groups, but it does seem the role is focused on close quarters combat across the board. Now, we can't jump into the first playtest without talking a little bit about the new Basrah. Despite knowing enough about Basrah and having played it enough to understand the general layout of the old map, this map feels so different. The density lends itself to more lanes of attack, especially if you're playing invasion. On the old Basrah, it was easy for teams to get caught up in the open deserts because there was very limited coverage. Now with the expanded city areas, more buildings and assets in the way, it offers, I think, a more balanced opportunity for attacks, especially heading into the town. And clearly with the eastern side of the map being open and playable now, that is all mixed in with orchards and buildings, small villages, there's a ton of opportunity for a different style of play on the same map that we're accustomed to. So while the layout may be similar, it feels incredibly new. In fact, I found myself getting a little bit disoriented just because it was that new to me, especially spawning in positions that we didn't normally have before. The couple of invasion rounds I did play in Basrah felt much more drawn out, and it was actually achievable for the attacking team to push the downtown, largely because of that detail in the lanes, how they have a little bit more cover to actually make that attack or push. I think generally what I'm noticing in this playtest, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, especially on some of the other maps, is just the sort of visual fidelity that you have to look through sometimes to find targets. This goes back to the sort of detail you find with this map. It is so detailed that it actually takes you a little bit longer to start to find those targets because you're looking through so much. If you know the current client of Squad, you know some buildings feel pretty empty, but that's a little bit different with Unreal 5, especially on Basrah and these new assets, because they do feel a little more populated, giving more areas of cover. Not to mention the shadows and things that you might have to contend with when going into dark buildings can be another layer added to the challenge of finding targets within a confined space. It's really going to set itself apart from maps that we currently have versus this brand new map because, again, there's so much detail, so much more to look through. When you play something like Narva, especially in that urban environment, it's going to feel a little bit empty. Now, if we hop over to maps we're pretty familiar with, we can look at Yeho. I did get a chance to play one round of this on the playtest, and I was surprised at just how different it feels. I think the color palette seems a little bit adjusted, but something noticeable too was the distance fog and sort of the removal of that with Unreal 5. So you have greater visibility at longer distances, but there's also this sort of trade-off with the fidelity of the trees and stuff like that. I think it's harder to find individuals just hiding or lurking about, especially in high contrast areas. Because of some of those shadows created, especially depending on the time of day that the map is being played within, make it more difficult to find enemies. Likewise, you can hide a little bit more effectively in tree lines, which may be more so dependent on the density of that tree line and the contrast because of the time of day. But it does seem like the visual upgrades you get with Unreal 5, especially when it comes to lighting, do actually affect some of the combat. I think it's going to slow some of the firefights down. Not to mention, pushing into the sun can be a little bit more challenging than hiding in the shade or backlit against opponents that are running through something like an open field. Where Squad Unreal Engine 4 typically created a more flat experience, you're going to have much more dynamic contrast in this version of Squad. Now, something that I haven't witnessed on my own yet would be in an armor fight on a map like Yerifka, because obviously you're going to have longer distance sight lines with the reduction of the visual fog you get, especially at long range. Is that going to slow down armor fights or just make them so that you're kind of playing at those longer distances? I think my initial impression is that you'll get longer ranged armor fights generally, but I think the threat of having AT in a tree line is more significant now, especially with the contrast we talked about a minute ago. Now, I'm interested to see how this plays out because I think Squad has leaned more into the need for infantry to have vehicles available to help with transportation. How does lighting and visibility changes sort of make infantry play with vehicles, but also how do vehicles play within that space? And that's something I'm sure we'll discover with more playtests and more time in this engine. But I do think there would be some adjustments in terms of how armor players are going to play, because I don't think it's as reliable to sit on a hill near some trees and try to hope that the visual fog and maybe some shadows will keep you covered, because you are just going to stand out, especially on a faraway hill, compared to what we have in Unreal 4. So obviously Yerifka is a vegetation heavy map, which is going to offer its own set of challenges compared to the urban environment of something like you're going to get in the downtown area of Basrah or Narva or wherever. I also played around in Fallujah, but that was largely in a striker. But between the vegetation heavy maps and the urban heavy maps, you do have your own set of challenges. And I think it's dialed up again because of the lighting and visual upgrades with Unreal 5. So I largely found myself playing slower in certain environments, taking my time, checking bushes maybe more than I normally would. The same goes for buildings, checking the windows or the balconies a little bit longer than I might normally. So my pace has slowed down and it's made things feel a little bit different from a gameplay perspective. I felt like I was grading certain pushes to be ineffective much faster because I just didn't feel like I had any sort of advantage in that push. Like the balance of pushing into certain directions or against certain things just felt not in my favor. And I mean that in the context of lighting and how it affected the area that I was moving through. Now, I think we should talk a little bit about performance. On the first Basrah round I played for the playtest, performance was a little bit shaky at best. The second map I got to play was Yerifka, which felt a little bit more balanced and smooth, although I had adjusted some settings. Now for the playtest, I was running at 1440p with a max in-game FPS of 144. I was running NVIDIA DLSS, and on the first map of Basrah, I was playing with DLAA on. I then switched that to balanced and received much better performance overall. But my main concern is still picture-in-picture scopes, where I see the most drop-off in performance. I think a lot of times on average, I was somewhere around 15 frames of drop-off. Now, I will note that Offworld did say this is an area that is still a work in progress, which makes sense because this is a playtest. Considering I think we already faced some performance issue with picture-in-picture scopes in Unreal 4, I'm curious to see what Offworld can do to help offset this. On the flip side of that, though, without the picture-in-picture scopes, I felt like performance was pretty stable. I had two crashes. One was at the very forefront of me playing, which just seemed to be related to a cache I needed to delete. And then the second one came while in a vehicle on Fallujah much later in the day. Overall, though, I felt like hitching was reduced from what I'm consistently seeing in Unreal 4. Outside of the first map of Basrah, I didn't really notice much hitching or anything that seriously interrupted the immersion or gameplay experience. As I mentioned in my previous video, I had issues running Harju, for example, on Unreal 4, where I was getting something like 50 frames, but I was hitching all over the place. And this, I felt like a lot of times I was running at 70 frames, but there wasn't the hitching. I do realize too that to some extent Basrah, the new one specifically, may play better because of new assets, and it's not really a good comparison to take that against Unreal 4's Basrah. And I also realize that taking some of these maps like Yerifka that may not be fully in Unreal 5 from the standpoint of assets and foliage may also have a little bit of a difference in performance. While this was a first playtest, I think that this was largely going to be focused on stability, both client and server side, handling some of the larger bugs that would make it difficult to just play the game even for a small period of time. Some of the feedback I even was witnessing seemed to be relatively positive. Some folks obviously struggling with performance, but some folks actually feeling like this was a good direction and a good start, especially for the first playtest of Unreal 5. I noticed there was a lot of curiosity as to when the intended release is of Unreal 5, but I think that's pretty far out. My expectation would be multiple playtests before we get close to that. Even with the infantry combat overhaul, I think we had about 2 months worth of playtesting before that was implemented into the game. That was almost weekly playtests, and I'm not sure what the frequency will be here because I do feel like this is a larger project given the context of what they're trying to do and how much it affects. But with all that said, let me know your thoughts on the playtest down below. Hit the subscribe button if you have not already, and we'll continue to follow up with more updates related to Unreal 5. And with that, see you next time.